This week, the 47th Parliament will officially open. It will be the most diverse in our history, with more women and more Indigenous representatives elected than ever before. The Prime Minister says he wants this Parliament to be a more constructive one, but late on Friday, the government released a scathing Home Affairs report revealing the former PM, Scott Morrison, pressured the department to release information about the interception of an asylum seeker boat at the 11th hour on election day. I spoke to Prime Minister Albanese earlier. Let's start with the release of this Home Affairs report. The Secretary says that the apolitical character of the public service was preserved in this instance because the public servants didn't amplify that news of the boat arrival on election day. Do you agree with the Secretary's assessment on that?
Well, the Secretary acted appropriately against the pressure from the then government. This was the final act of the Morrison government, and it was one that trashed convention and sought to abuse the relationship with the public service. It was a disgraceful event. It shouldn't have happened, and it should never happen again.
Mr Pezzullo has suggested amending the caretaker convention so that if there were to be sensitive information, that it's not released during an election campaign unless there is a threat to life or some other urgency of that magnitude. Will you look to change the caretaker convention in that sense?
Well, we'll have a look at any of the recommendations, but the point here is, Kieran, the word convention. Convention relies upon some element of decency and goodwill. That's the nature of convention as opposed to rules. And here we have a government that was prepared to trash the convention. The Morrison government weren't so much Conservatives because Conservatives believe in respecting institutions and respecting conventions. There was nothing respectful about the actions of the government on that day. It was opportunistic, it was unprincipled, it was unprecedented, and it shouldn't have happened.
Prime Minister, the return of Parliament, the 47th Parliament, the first sitting under your government, of the legislation and your priorities that you've outlined, do you expect the least contentious and therefore the first likely legislation to pass will be those aged care reforms?
Well, the aged care reforms are very important. Our legislation will introduce some 17 of the recommendations from the Aged Care Royal Commission. We've said that the Aged Care Royal Commission needs to be respected. The former government received the recommendations and then just sat on them. We want action to occur in aged care reform, and that is important legislation, but so too is the legislation on our emissions target, the legislation for 10 days paid domestic and family violence leave, the legislation to establish Jobs and Skills Australia. These are all a part of our position that we took to the election, that received the endorsement of the Australian people. We'll be introducing at least 18 pieces of legislation in our first week in Parliament because we don't want to waste a day. Australia has had a decade of neglect and drift. We want to make sure we get on with the reforms that are necessary in order to advance Australia's interests, in order to create a better future for Australia.